Jackie Luqman, and I want to read something to you today, an essay from quite a few decades ago. And I think it's very important that you hear this, that I share this with you, because I think it speaks volumes about where we are today electorally in 2024 compared to several decades ago when this essay was written. So come on this journey with me. Won't take too long, but sit back and enjoy. Since I was 21 in 1889, I have, in theory, followed the voting plan strongly advocated by Sidney Lenz in The Nation of August 4, i.e., voting for a third party, even when its chances were hopeless. If the main parties were unsatisfactory, or in absence of a third choice, voting for the lesser of two evils. My action, however, had to be limited by the candidate's attitude toward Negroes. Of my adult life, I have spent 23 years living and teaching in the South, where my voting choice was not asked. I was disenfranchised by law or administration. In the North, I lived in all of 32 years, covering 8 presidential elections. In 1912, I wanted to support Theodore Roosevelt, but his Bull Moose Convention dodged the Negro problem, and I tried to help elect Wilson as a liberal Southerner. Under Wilson came the worst attempt at Jim Crow legislation and discrimination in civil service that we had experienced since the Civil War. So in 1916, I took Hughes as the lesser of two evils. He promised Negroes nothing and kept his word. In 1920, I supported Harding because of his promise to liberate Haiti. In 1924, I voted for La Follette, although I knew he could not be elected. In 1928, Negroes faced absolute dilemma. Neither Hoover nor Smith wanted the Negro vote, and both publicly insulted us. I voted for Norman Thomas and the Socialists, although the Socialists had attempted to Jim Crow Negro members in the South. In 1932, I voted for Franklin Roosevelt, since Hoover was unthinkable and Roosevelt's attitude toward workers most realistic. I was again in the South from 1934 until 1944. Technically, I could vote, but the election in which I could vote was a farce. The real election was the white primary. You're just going to have to look that one up. Retired for age in 1944, I returned to the North and found a party to my liking. In 1948, I voted for the progressive ticket for Henry Wallace, and in 1952 for Vincent Hallinan. In 1956, I shall not go to the polls. I have not registered. I believe that democracy has so far disappeared in the United States that no two evils exist. There is but one evil party with two names, and it will be elected despite all I can do or say. There is no third party. On the presidential ballot in a few states, 17 in 1952, a socialist party will appear, but few will hear its appeals because it will have almost no opportunity to take part in the campaign and explain its platform. If a voter organizes or advocates a real third-party movement, he may be accused of seeking to overthrow this government by force and violence. Anything he advocates by way of significant reform will be called communist. and will, of necessity, be communist in the sense that it must advocate such things as government ownership of the means of production, government in business, the limitation of private profit, social medicine, government housing, and federal aid to education, the total abolition of race bias, and the welfare state. These things are on every communist program. These things are the aim of socialism. Any American who advocates them today, no matter how sincerely, stands in danger of losing his job, surrendering his social status, and perhaps landing in jail. The witnesses against him may be liars or insane or criminals. These witnesses need give no proof for their charges and may not even be known or appear in person. They may be in the pay of the United States government. ADAs and liberals, well, they're not third parties. They seek to act as tails to kites. But since the kites are self-propelled and radar-controlled, tails are quite superfluous and rather silly. The present administration, in 1956, remember, is carrying on the greatest preparation for war in the history of mankind. Stevenson promises to maintain or increase this effort. I will never not support Israel's right to defend itself. Yeah, the weight of our taxation is unbearable and rests mainly and deliberately on the poor. This administration is dominated and directed by wealth and for the accumulation of wealth. It runs smoothly, like a well-organized industry, and should do so because industry runs it for the benefit of industry. Industry runs the government for the benefit of industry. This is what he's saying. Corporate wealth profits as never before in history. This was in 1956. We turn over the national resources to private profit and have few funds left for education, housing, or health. Crime, especially juvenile crime, is increasing. Its increase is perfectly logical. For a generation, we've been teaching our youth to kill, destroy, steal, and rape in war. What can we expect in peace? We let men take wealth which is not theirs. If the seizure is legal, we call it high profits, and the profiteers help decide what is legal. The people who stole other people's money, they decide whether what they stole was legal. Yeah. If the theft is illegal, the thief can fight it out in court with excellent chances to win if he receives the accolade of the right newspapers. New York Times. Gambling in home, church, and on the stock market is increasing, and all prices are rising. It costs 3 times his salary to elect a senator and many millions to elect a president. This money comes from the very corporations which today are the government in 1956. This, in a real democracy, would be enough to turn the party responsible out of power. Yet this we cannot do. Why? Well, he goes on to say the other party has surrendered all party differences in foreign affairs. And foreign affairs are our most important affairs today and take most of our taxes. Even in domestic affairs, how does Stevenson differ from Eisenhower? Ooh, that question. How long we been asking that one? Since 1956. He uses better English than Dulles. Stevenson does, thank God. He has a sly humor where Eisenhower has none. Beyond this, Stevenson stands on the race question in the South, not far from where his godfather Adlai stood 63 years ago, which reconciles him to the South. Understand what is being said here. His position on black folks was screw 'em. And that reconciled Stevenson to the South, not black voters in the South, to the South. He had no clear policy on war or preparation for war, on water and flood control in 1956, y'all, on reduction of taxation, on the welfare state. He wavers on civil rights, and his party blocked civil rights in the Senate until Douglas of Illinois admitted that the Democratic Senate would and could stop even the right of senators to vote. Douglas had a right to complain. 3 million voters sent him to the Senate to speak for them. His voice was drowned and his vote was nullified by Eastland, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, who was elected by only 151,000 voters. 151,000 voters, and the person they elected overruled the voice of 3 million voters and their elected official. And the writer of this essay says in 1956, this is the democracy in the United States which we peddle abroad. Negroes hoped to muster 400,000 votes in 1956. Where will they cast them? What have the Republicans done to enforce the education decision of the Supreme Court? I believe he's talking about Brown versus Board of Education. What they advertised as fair employment was exactly nothing, and Nixon was just the man to explain it. What has the administration done to rescue Negro workers, the most impoverished group in the nation, while the nation sends billions abroad to protect oil investments? The wars have always been about oil and other natural resources that do not belong to this government or the people who run it. To protect oil investments and help employ slave labor in the Union of South Africa and the Rhodesias. Yes, the U.S. government was colluding with the apartheid governments of South Africa and Rhodesia to exploit the forced labor of Africans in those countries, the indigenous population, to mine those resources for the profit of U.S. and Western corporate entities and their racist, white supremacist, settler colonial Dutch collaborators. Very well, the essayist continues. And will the party of Talmadge, Eastland, and Ellender do better than the Republicans if Negroes return them to office? I have no advice for others in this election. Are you voting Democratic? Well and good. All I ask is why? Are you voting for Eisenhower and his smooth team of bright ghostwriters? Again, why? Will your helpless vote either way support or restore democracy in America? Is the refusal to vote in this phony election in 1956 a counsel of despair? No. It is dogged hope. It is hoped that if 25 million voters refrained from voting in 1956 because of their own accord and not because of a sly wink from Khrushchev, this might make the American people ask how much longer this dumb farce can proceed without even a whimper of protest. Yet, if we protest, off the nation goes to Russia and China. 55 American ministers and philanthropists are asking the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, quote, to face manfully the doubts and promptings of their conscience, end quote. Cannot these do-gooders face their own consciences? Can they not see that American culture is rotting away? Our honesty, our human sympathy, our literature, save what we import from abroad. Our only review of literature, the essayist says, has wisely dropped literature from its name. And I think he's talking about the National Review, which I think used to be called the National Literature Review. I could be incorrect on that. Y'all, please fact check me if I'm wrong. But that's coming to mind, but I could be wrong. So please fact check me. But let's continue. Our manners are gone. And the one thing we want is to be rich, to show off. Success is measured by income. University education is for income, not culture, and is partially supported by private industry. This was in 1956. Business is built on successful lying, called advertising. We want money in vast amount, no matter how we get it. So we have it. And what then? Is the answer the election of 1956? We can make a sick man president and tell him and set him to do a job which would strain a man in robust health. So he dies. And what do we get to lead us? With Stevenson and Nixon, with Eisenhower and Eastland, we remain in the same mess. I will be no party to it. And that will make little difference. You will take large part and bravely march to the polls. And that will also make no difference. Stop running Russia and giving the Chinese advice when we cannot rule ourselves decently. Stop yelling about a democracy we do not have. Democracy is dead in the United States. Yet there is still nothing to replace real democracy. Drop the chains, then, that bind our brains. Drive the money changers from the seats of the cabinet and the halls of Congress. Call back some faint spirit of Jefferson and Lincoln. Yeah, I know. Yeah, we'll talk about that later. And when again we can hold a fair election on real issues, let's vote. And not until then. Is this impossible? Holding a fair election in America? The essayist asks at the end of this amazing essay that sounds like he wrote it yesterday. He asks, is holding a fair election on real issues in America impossible? And he ends the essay by saying, then democracy in America is impossible. Now, I did not write this essay. I am an okay writer, I guess. And I can be pretty eloquent when I'm riffing off the top of my head at a protest or doing an interview online. But I'm not this eloquent. Because this essay was written in 1956 and it was published in The Nation magazine. The essay was written by W.E.B. Du Bois. And the title of the essay is I Won't Vote. Everything Du Bois laid out in this essay in 1956, of course, 14, 6, 6, 12, 8, 11, 6, oh, Jesus, 9, what was that, 68 years, I think. We shall edit it. 1956 minus 2020. Oops. 2024. 68. Yep. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote this 3, 2, 1. Everything W.E.B. Du Bois said in this essay in 1956 is still the reality in the electoral system in this country in 2024. Everything Du Bois said about third parties not having an opportunity to share their policies and platforms with the nation was true then. It is even more true now. What he said about third-party voters advocating for the guaranteeing of human rights like housing, healthcare, education, clean environment. Those are human rights. They are not entitlements. We are not asking for things that we do not deserve. Every human being deserves those things because they are human beings. And every human being should have quality education, safe housing, decent job that pays well so they can live on one job with dignity, pay their bills, take care of, feed, clothe, house their families, and have a little bit of leisure time to, explore what being human really is. When people advocate for third parties and those policies in particular, even in 2024, what are they called? Communists. And not just communists. Now they don't call people advocating for these things communists. Now we're called Russian agents, agents of Putin, or agents of China. We are the puppets of Xi Jinping. Why? Because we don't want to be homeless. Because we don't want to live in a society in which your level of income dictates the quality of education you get. We don't want to live in a society where you have to work 2 and 3 jobs in order to afford rent on an apartment that you can barely fit your family in, that isn't a great place to live, that is run by a slumlord who is allowed to mistreat their tenants in any way they want and jack up the rent anytime they feel like it. We're called agents of Putin and agents of China and agents of Xi Jinping because we recognize that the government of this country does have a responsibility to take care of the needs of its citizens. It supposedly says that in these founding documents they claim are so sacred. But if those documents are actually sacred, and if they really meant what they wrote in them, why are our people now being criminalized under the Biden-Harris administration for doing exactly what W.E.B. Du Bois said in 1956? Still doing this. Still. And since this essay was written, by the way, and even before this essay was written, both political parties, Republicans and Democrats, have taken turns repressing radical dissent or even expression, definitely protest. So the trial of the Uhuru Three, not new. It's a continuation of what W.E.B. Du Bois was talking about when he talked about as soon as we protest, off the country goes to Russia and China. What he was saying was off the country goes blaming Russia or China on all of these Negroes being angry and agitated about their rights. Even Du Bois said in 1956 that the people who are the elected officials in this country and the media has been dismissing the legitimate suffrage demands of black people by saying we're only angry because the Russians or the Chinese told us that we should be angry, not because we were denied human dignity for more than 2 centuries in this country under chattel slavery, and then almost 100 years under Jim Crow after that, and then the continued discrimination and marginalization of our people since Jim Crow was repealed, at least legally. All of those things that Du Bois pointed out in 1956 are still happening right now in 2024 under the Biden-Harris administration. Please don't separate the FBI from the administration that is in office when the FBI goes after people, because the FBI is not a rogue organization that just runs off and does its own stuff all by itself. Oh no. And neither is the CIA, neither is the NSA, neither are any of the alphabet intelligence agencies, the ones that you don't even know about. There are a lot of them. No, they don't operate independently. They operate on the orders of the White House. Yes, there are certainly people in the agency who take the initiative to go after the radicals. Because, I mean, it's the FBI. It's the FBI. But it is not done without the direction and the approval of the administration occupying the White House. And it does not matter whether that administration is a Republican or a Democrat. Under both, we have always been targeted and criminalized for demanding that our rights and the rights of other working class, poor, oppressed, and marginalized people in this country and around the world be recognized, that the sovereignty of people in other countries be respected, and people's self-determination in other countries and domestically be recognized and honored. That we be treated like human beings. That our rights as human beings are respected in this alleged so-called democracy. And if they're not, then we cannot call this a democracy. Every time we stand up and say the simple truth about the way we are mistreated in this country, and the way this country's government mistreats our people on the continent, throughout the diaspora, and other working class, poor, oppressed, peasant people, anti-imperialists, anti-capitalists around the world, every time we stand up for the rights of the people, the U.S. government under both administrations cracks down on us. We are called Russian agents. We are called Chinese agents by politicians and in the media. By the press, the accepted press. And many of you go right along with it. Just like Du Bois said in 1956, I will not go to the polls. And that is not going to make any difference. It's not going to matter that I don't go to the polls. Many of you will march dutifully right off to the polls. Many of you will. And that's not going to matter either. Not going to matter either. So here we are in 2024, listening to an essay that was written 68 years ago about the lack of democracy in the American electoral system. And everything this man said in 1956, everything W.E.B. Du Bois said in 1956 about electoral politics in this country, the dismissal, the silencing, the disappearing of third parties and their candidates, the criminalization of third party voters, the absolute oppression of radicals, of socialists, of communists, of progressives. Aren't we living through all of that right now? On top of, or maybe not on top of, but with a genocide, a couple of them. On top of that, the Uhuru 3, charged with 2 counts, one conspiring to be Russian agents and the other of being Russian agents. They were found not guilty of being Russian agents, of acting as agents for Russia, but they were found guilty of conspiring to do the thing that they were not found guilty of doing, which makes no sense, which should tell you how the U.S. government goes after our people. Exactly what Du Bois said. There were no witnesses. There were no witnesses that could prove anything. The government's witness in that trial was proven on the stand, was shown on the stand to admit that none of the information they culled through to find evidence that Penny Hess, Jesse Neville, and Chairman Omali Yeshitela were acting as agents of a foreign government or even conspired to. She admitted this on the stand. There was no evidence that they found supporting either of those charges. And that FBI witness said that when the indictment was signed, they knew the charges were bullshit, but they signed the indictment anyway because they knew that they could go into a court and throw as much information at the jury as they could and confuse people enough to get them to deliver a guilty verdict on something, anything. Didn't even matter if it made sense. So now these 3 people, Chairman Omali Yeshitela, who has been doing this, he's headed the African People's Socialist Party for 60 years. Telling the truth about U.S. imperialism and challenging capitalism, advocating for internationalism, 60 years. This government has a very long memory, and if it doesn't get around to the radicals that it wants to get rid of in the first few rounds, they'll come back around to you. They just came back around to Chairman Omali and his allies in the Uhuru movement. They're now facing 5 years in federal prison. Sentencing date has not yet been set. Of course, they're going to appeal the conviction. But this is done under a Biden-Harris administration. These people are innocent. These people are not guilty of doing anything other than telling the truth, just like W.E.B. Du Bois did in 1956. How about the Stop Cop City protesters? The way they have been criminalized and marginalized, and physically assaulted and terrorized by the police to the point that one of them was murdered. Tortuguita was murdered in cold blood by Atlanta law enforcement. No one has been held accountable for his death. No one will be. Dozens of Stop Cop City protesters are awaiting trial on charges of RICO conspiracies, racketeer influenced corrupt organization charges. You know those charges, the charges the government came up with to take down the mob, the mafia. The U.S. government under the Biden-Harris administration is using RICO charges to criminalize people who are protesting using their tax dollars to destroy the environment, to cut down an enormous forest, to build a police base. Yeah, a domestic militarized police base, and not just one. Oh no, because cop cities don't just exist or are not just being proposed for Atlanta. There are cop city plans all over this country. We've seen how the state responds to protests against Cop City. Isn't that what W.E.B. Du Bois said in 1956? That anytime we challenge this government, we protest, we get called agents of a foreign government. We get called communists. We get called agents of Putin and China. Yeah, he said that in 1956. It's still going on now. Are you one of those people who is quick to call somebody a Russian agent or an agent of China because they recognize this government has way more money than it always claims it doesn't have for things that we need, but it always seems to have enough money to give the Department of Defense every year, and the Department of Defense loses a couple $1 trillion every year. Trillion with a T. They lose trillions of dollars. Don't know where it is, don't know what they did with it, and nobody is holding them accountable for it. And on top of that, all of the weapons being sent to the Zionist apartheid entity to murder, massacre, genocide Arabs. Our tax dollars going to that instead of our taxes going to what we want to pay our taxes for, which is to take care of the people here and to leave people in other countries alone to handle their own affairs. Du Bois said this in 1956. We are still dealing with this in 2024. So I hope hearing this essay, and I will give you a link to it so you can read it and really sit and think about what is said and what Du Bois is saying here, what it means for us today. If you get to the end of this essay and you conclude, as Du Bois did, that if it is impossible to hold a fair election in this country where one political party is not suing to kick third parties off the ballots in swing states, to keep people from having the option, which is supposed to be their right, to vote for whomever they choose. And then you have the other party that is actively keeping as many people as they can from voting at all. If that is going on in 2024, how can you say this is a fair election? And if, as Du Bois states, we should not vote until a fair election can happen in this country. If, when you get to the end of this essay and you answer the question that he asks, is this impossible? If your answer is, yeah, it's impossible, because it's been 68 years since you pointed out these problems that have not only remained in 2024, but have gotten worse. If your answer to this question is yes, it's impossible, then you need to admit that democracy in America is impossible. And if democracy in America is impossible, why are you voting for one of the two major political parties who are the ones who are making it impossible for fair elections in this country to happen in the first place? You cannot vote for a political candidate to save a democracy that doesn't exist. Thanks for listening. Please read this article, study it, commit it to memory if you have to. It is vitally important for our survival past November 5th. Because electoral politics in this system as it exists, it is not going to save us. So we need to start asking ourselves, what will? I hope you get brave enough to ask those of us who are left, who've been trying to tell you all this time. Be well, be aware, be engaged, and be honest about what this system is and whether you want everybody else to be free or if you're okay with everybody else continuing to be manipulated by forces that do not care about humanity at all. Peace, if you are willing to fight for it.